Okay.
And so it's good to go.
In real life scenarios. That's what the training is about. Because half the training is shadowing you guys.
All right, welcome back to the Nexus Podcast.
Okay, these are because actually you're on.
Slowik is with me.
Who's the durable contact in the
Thunder.
I am. Thanks for having me back. It must not have been too bad the first time around.
No, not at all. It was great.
Let me read
It's nice.
Do I supplement?
Exactly.
So obviously here at RSA, how's the show going for you?
Show's going great. Certainly every year I think has a theme, and I think we found out the theme this year is a surprise for artificial intelligence. But there's a lot going on in this space, and it's been pretty exciting to see it unfold over the past week with 30,000 of my closest friends.
Okay. So I know you did talk this week. Kind of a unique spin on critical infrastructure, how we're assessing the state of things, high level, the elevator pitch on your call.
Yeah, so the elevator pitch for the talk is that critical infrastructure defense is a interesting tension between individual organizations that operate in critical spaces are incentivized to view themselves as being the most important thing that's going on. Defending my own organization is the most important thing. But if we take a step up in the layer of abstraction, a national government or similar, then not everything can be critical, otherwise nothing is. So how do we start prioritizing response and resources to start ensuring getting back to the return on that investment in terms of defensive resources, but also at the same time acknowledging the ethical dilemma that pretty much just leave some entities behind because they're not the most important. And so how do we balance those tensions? And there might not be a really good way of balancing them, but even just acknowledging that disconnect exists, I think is important to start solving the issue.
Will better from some others to me.
I hope not. The idea wasn't to try and call people out as doing something wrong or otherwise, but rather just to get people to start realizing that, hey, everyone wants everything to be defended. We all want clean water. We all want reliable power, etc. But you spread resources too thin across too many entities, and it starts to become too diffuse to have an impact anymore.
It's our fault. We appreciate it, and then everybody has this self-report.
Right. Yeah, and there's incentivization around this as well, but one of the inspiring items behind this is that for some of your listeners who are already familiar with, or others who are not, the DHS within the United States has defined critical infrastructure as encompassing 16 sectors, 20 sectors. And you start digging into those 16 sectors, and you think about it, like, well, this is basically everything anyway. So if those are all the critical things, and everything is critical, then what is most important of the things that are already critical? They're really trying to pick that apart. So again, not saying that DHS is wrong, but really trying to just argue that we need to think about this a little harder and then start prioritizing on things that we really want to have an impact, or the impact that we desire.
What do you think's behind this kind of approach, this mindset?
I think it's the same sort of mindset we have in security, where no one wants to be the person who missed something. And so, it's a classic scope creep issue. It's like, okay, well, electric utilities are important. It's like, well, so are hospitals. It's like, well, in order for hospitals to function, you need clean water. Well, and then the people who are providing the materials that are used in hospitals and manufacturing are important too. And all these other things start piling on one another, that it becomes very difficult to say, stop. Like, this is no longer not as significant anymore, because no one wants to be the person whose name goes under the decision that I said that this organization was insignificant and something bad happened.
Do you think that impedes anything in terms of the resource allocation organization? One of the things that I understand from macro.
I think the real areas of concern are twofold. One is at the macro level of resource allocation and need identification. Okay, what is most important or simply important? If I'm talking about allocation of scarce resources, whether public sector or even private sector, to maintain continuity of the economy, continuity of government, and similar. What do I basically need in order to make that happen? That's the macro side. And then the micro side, individual organizations, an actual realistic understanding of what can I genuinely anticipate in terms of support and guidance from higher level authorities if things hit the fan. Because I don't think we've been as honest with our organizations. We're like, okay, CISA does the best job that it can in the U.S. We have national level certs in other countries the same. They can't respond to everything. And even from a private sector perspective, yes, I have a incident response retainer with a very impressive sounding firm. If things start happening at a level of a whole typhoon degree of disruption. Do those firms have enough resources to respond to everyone at once? Probably not. So who gets their first bite at the apple in these sorts of circumstances? And is that communicated so that organizations that may be left behind at least know that and can plan appropriately in terms of things like business continuity planning, disaster recovery planning, and the physical space and the administrative space, so that operations will be severely degraded, but they might still at least be available to some extent instead of being completely shut down because expectations didn't match the reality.
And do you think that like there's a government kind of sectors or
to a degree, I would imagine there has to be.
Yeah.
I think where things get interesting is that to what degree is that communicated to stakeholders? Now, and I made this clear in my presentation earlier this week at RSA, I'd never expect that list, nor should it ever become public for a variety of reasons. But some way of taking a hard-nosed approach to it, and hey, you know what, this is where you fall based on the overall scheme of things. Therefore, plan appropriately what resources may be available to you in the event of a disruptive incident in the cyber landscape that impedes or impairs the delivery of services.
you can see how some people in the moment get
Yeah, exactly. And you know, it's a fair assessment because we like to think that when it comes to the provision of public goods, like I make this analogy all the time. We don't expect any organization in the United States to use that as our specific example here to defend themselves against an ICBM attack from the Russian Federation. That's unrealistic and no one's going to do that. Missile defense is delegated to national level military defense. Yet, in the cyber landscape, we have effectively, if you look at some of the recent executive orders coming out of the current administration, maybe even pushing more aggressively to sort of down selecting or pushing response closer to a local level where resourcing is very interesting and not even existent in some cases. And what does that mean for how we're able to do these sorts of actions? And I think some folks expect like, well, if something really bad happens, the FBI will show up, or DHS will show up, or Cybercom will show up. Right, and having some clear expectation was like, you know what, in a really bad situation, they're not. So how are we positioned to respond from our own organization standpoint in that circumstance in order to make sure we're doing the best we can to maintain services to our customer and service base.
Is the problem with very critical in ways
that was the kickoff of my presentation, that taking an actual look at defining critical would be key. And then there's the classic Incredibles syndrome meme, like, if everyone's super no one is, well, if everything's critical, then nothing really is at the end of the day, because you have to make some prioritization from it. So then as we take a step back and look at things like, again, defining the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, or the CERCIA legislation on incident response reporting that was passed a few years ago, it's supposed to come into effect next year. We'll see in the current environment if that actually happens. Looking at the CERCIA definitions of criticality and covered entities, they're fairly broad, fairly quickly in terms of what's covered. And is that right? I mean, maybe for CERCIA, when it comes to information gathering, it is appropriate. But if we start using that as a guide for what entities are responsible for maintaining a level of defense that can hold its own against a state-directed intrusion or state-directed disruption activity, that starts to become fairly murky very quickly. Potentially. Again, it's going to be difficult because we're seeing, I think, pretty significant change, at least on the U.S. side of things, in terms of how regulation and federal guidance is going to swing when it comes to private operators and critical infrastructure. And I think we're seeing less emphasis on that sort of policy discussion. So some of the things that appear to be going forward previously, even going back to like the P2021 stuff or whatever, I would expect that to get dialed back a little bit in the future, but we'll see how all that shakes out. But even still, these are important national security issues for, again, continuity of government, continuity of society. So something needs to try to coordinate these sorts of items and figure out, well, in a true emergency, where do scarce response and recovery resources get allocated?
Brought up private entities. Much of that conversation what real percentages of private ownership. How does that come?
It complicates things significantly, and one of the things I brought up in my presentation that makes things even more interesting to discuss is that, on the one hand, some of the largest entities that are operating, like your investor-owned utilities and similar, with very large customer bases covering wide swaths of the U.S. economy. On the one hand, those seem like, well, these are the systemically important entities for ensuring continuity of the economy and resilience of the economy. These are also entities that they have a fairly significant amount of resources. Should we expect and advocate for those organizations doing more on their own, above and beyond what they're doing presently, to shoulder more of that burden and then shift public resources to the have-nots within the space? Because there's plenty of cooperatives, municipals, local and regional hospital networks and similar that don't have the resources to respond to these events. And this gets into questions of distributive justice, which is really interesting and really thorny, really fast, and it becomes fascinating to talk about. I don't have a good solution for how to actually resolve it right now, other than just acknowledging that, hey, we have some disconnects here.
Just picturing that.